In the spring of 1887, a stranger passing through Willow Bend Creek asked an old woman sitting on a wide porch why such a large cabin had been built for only 2 people. She smiled, squeezed the weathered hand beside hers, and said simply, "It was never built for 2. He did not understand. Not yet. Spring came to Montana Territory in 1872, the way it always did, sudden and generous, as if the land had been holding its breath all winter and finally let go. Elias Harrow was 25 years old the morning he lifted Mara across the threshold of nothing. No door yet, no walls, just a rectangle of staked rope on new grass, and whispered, "A house is only as large as the love inside it." She laughed and believed him completely. Willow Bend Creek had not yet earned its name on any official map, but the water knew what it was, clear and unhurried, bending through a low meadow rimmed by cottonwoods whose new leaves caught the light like scattered coins. Elias had chosen this place the previous autumn, traveling 3 days on horseback from Billings with a land grant folded in his breast pocket and a particular kind of quiet certainty in his chest. He had written to Mara that same week. "Come in spring," he said. "Bring only what matters." She had brought herself, her mother's quilt, and a small tin box of apple seeds. They married on a Thursday beneath an open sky, with a circuit preacher and 2 neighboring homesteaders as witnesses, and by Friday morning they were already measuring ground. The cabin they planned was remarkable for its size. Any passerby, and there were few enough of those, might have looked at the staked perimeter and assumed a boarding house was being raised. 4 rooms beyond the main hall, 2 full sleeping chambers upstairs, a wide front porch, a kitchen with space enough for a long table. 6 chairs at least, Mara said one afternoon, kneeling in the grass with a charcoal stick and a flat piece of pine bark she used for sketching. Maybe 8. Elias was notching a log, and he paused to look at her over his shoulder. "Planning on feeding the whole territory?" "Planning on needing to," she said, and the way she said it, soft and certain, like a woman who has already imagined a future in full detail, made him set down his tools and walk over and sit beside her in the grass. They looked at the sketch together. Rooms with names not yet spoken aloud. Windows placed just where morning light would fall on small, sleeping faces. The apple seeds were already in the ground near the south fence. Every evening that first spring, they worked until the light failed, then sat on the bare earth where the porch would be, shoulders touching, listening to the creek. They were so sure of everything. It was Mara who first said the word nursery. She said it on a warm June evening, standing in the room at the top of the stairs, the one with the east-facing window that would catch the earliest light. The walls were still raw timber. The floor was swept pine. She had brought up a single candle and stood holding it, turning slowly, measuring the space with her eyes. "This one," she said when Elias appeared in the doorway. "This is the nursery." He came and stood beside her, and together they looked at the empty room as if it were already full of something, sound or warmth, or some approaching life not yet arrived. He built a small wooden cradle the following week, sanded it smooth, set it beneath the east window. It was the first piece of furniture in the house. Summer that first year was long and kind. The cabin rose log by log through July and August, and Mara worked alongside Elias at every stage, steadying timber, mixing clay and straw for chinking, hauling river stones for the hearth. She was not a large woman, but she was capable in the way that frontier life required, economical with effort, steady under difficulty, always finding the practical solution before the worrying one. The rooms filled slowly. A bed frame, a table, and 2 chairs, though Mara always referenced the eventual 6 when she arranged the space, leaving deliberate gaps as placeholders. But as summer turned and the first autumn settled over the meadow, something small and unspoken began to gather at the edges of their days. Not a shadow exactly, more like a question neither had yet formed into words. They had spoken freely of children since before their marriage. It was simply understood, woven into every plan. The rooms, the chairs, the garden planted larger than 2 people could reasonably eat from. Children were not a hope so much as an expectation, the natural next chapter of the life they were building. But autumn came, and the question remained unasked. Elias noticed, without remarking on it, that Mara sometimes stood in the doorway of the nursery in the early mornings before he rose, just standing. Not sad, or not exactly, but quiet in a way that was different from her usual morning stillness. He began, without discussion, to do small things. He added a second rocking chair to the porch, so she was never sitting alone. He planted a row of black-eyed Susans along the nursery window on the outside, so that when the blooms came the following spring, she would see color from that room. He told her stories in the evenings, long, winding stories about what their children might be like, the names they were considering, the arguments those children would inevitably have with each other, and how Mara would settle them with one raised eyebrow. She laughed at those stories. She added her own details. They spoke of the future as if it were still arriving, only taking its time. And in truth, they believed it was. Winter arrived early that year, sudden and absolute, and the cabin held. Ice formed along the shallows of Willowbend Creek, and the cottonwoods went bare, and the meadow turned the pale gray gold of dried grass under snow. But inside, the hearth burned steadily. The quilts were thick, and the rooms, empty as most of them still were, felt full of potential rather than absence. On New Year's Eve, Elias carved the year into the lintel above the front door, 1872. Beneath it, in smaller letters, E and M, Harrow. Mara traced the letters with her fingertip and said, "Next year we'll need more names up there." He nodded. "Next year." Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she arrived on a March afternoon in 1874 with a broken wagon wheel and a baby on her hip and 3 more children trailing behind her in the mud. Mara had the door open before Ruth reached the porch. That was how it began, not with ceremony, but with an open door and a pot already on the stove. Ruth stayed 4 days while Elias repaired the wheel. By the time she left, the kitchen table had finally felt like itself, loud, crowded, and fully alive. Spring returned to the meadow with its usual disregard for human troubles, painting the hillside in green and scattering wildflowers along the creek bank as if the long gray winter had been nothing more than a brief interruption. The apple trees, grown now from Mara's seeds into sturdy young saplings with white blossoms, lined the south fence in a row that Elias said looked like a wedding procession. "They're practicing," Mara told him, and handed him his coffee. The cabin had settled into itself by 1874, the timber darkening to a rich amber, the porch acquiring the slight sag that comes not from neglect, but from use. From 2 people sitting on it in all weathers, watching seasons change. Elias had added a second window to the nursery that winter, and new curtains had been hung, white with a small yellow pattern that Mara had ordered from a catalog and waited 3 months to receive. The room remained otherwise as it was. The cradle under the window, a small chest against the wall, a braided rug on the floor. Neither of them spoke of it directly. but neither of them changed it. The years were teaching them a particular kind of patience, not the passive, waiting kind, but something more active, a patience that kept its hands busy. Mara had expanded the garden considerably by the 3rd year, and what they could not eat, she put up in jars that lined the pantry shelf in rows of amber and red and deep green. Elias had begun taking on small repair jobs for neighbors, a roof here, a fence there, and the Harrow cabin had quietly become a waypoint, a place people knew they could stop. Ruth Calloway's visit had started something without meaning to. After her, there were others. A trapper named Silas, who came in out of a November storm and sat at the table eating Mara's cornbread with the focused gratitude of a man who had not tasted home cooking in months. A family of 4 from Ohio, the Birch family, father, mother, twin girls of about 7, who stopped for a single night in the summer of 1875 and ended up staying 4 days because one of the girls came down with a fever and Mara would not hear of them traveling until the child was steady on her feet. Those 4 days were among the warmest Elias could remember. The twin girls, Adelaide and June, took to Mara immediately in the way children do when they sense someone who is entirely comfortable in their company. They followed her through the garden, learning the names of plants. They sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures while she cooked. They asked her, with the frank curiosity of children, why her house was so big. Because big houses need filling, Mara told them simply, and Adelaide nodded as if this were obvious. On the evening before the Birch family left, Mara brought the girls upstairs to see the nursery. Elias stood in the hallway and listened. He heard June ask about the cradle, and heard Mara explain that it was handmade, and June said it was the prettiest thing she had ever seen. And there was a pause, and then Mara said softly that she hoped June would make something beautiful for someone she loved one day, and June said she already knew what it would be, a quilt, like the one on Mara's bed. Elias went back downstairs. He stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the apple trees in the evening light, their young branches beginning to thicken, their roots deeper now than anyone could see. Then he began washing the supper dishes. Mara came down 20 minutes later and stood beside him and picked up a cloth to dry, and they did not speak immediately. But her shoulder was against his, and his was against hers, and the evening was warm, and the creek moved past outside the way it always did, unhurried, certain of where it was going. The years arranged themselves the way years do when they are full, not in a long straight line but in layers, each season pressing down gently on the one before it, the way snowfall builds a drift, imperceptibly, and then all at once you notice how much has accumulated. By 1879, the apple trees were bearing fruit. Mara made cider that autumn, filling the whole cabin with a sweetness that seemed to come from the walls themselves, and Elias carried jars of it to 3 neighboring families before keeping any for themselves. That was the year they built the second porch off the kitchen, a smaller one, facing east, that caught the morning light and became Mara's particular territory. Her reading chair, her seed catalogs, her small collection of stones from the creek that she arranged and rearranged without apparent purpose, but with great satisfaction. Elias added a name to the lintel that year, chiseling carefully beneath the original, 1879, and still becoming. Mara stood back and read it and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always did have a talent for the right word." He handed her the mallet. "Help me with the G. I can never get the G right." She had never carved anything in her life, and she did not get the G right either, and they were both laughing by the time it was done, and the letter was crooked and slightly too deep, and neither of them would have straightened it for anything. The extra rooms had never acquired children, but they had acquired character. The room they had always called, privately, the nursery, was still kept as it was: cradle, curtains, braided rug. But the other rooms had filled gradually with the residue of an open life. Quilts folded for guests, a writing desk where Mara kept her correspondence, shelves of tools and seed catalogs, and the small, practical library of a working homestead. The long table in the kitchen finally had its 6 chairs. They had come, one at a time, over years, each with a small history. One from a neighbor who was moving on, one built by Elias on a slow winter afternoon, one that Ruth Calloway had sent on a wagon the Christmas after her visit with a note that said simply, "For your table." The table was rarely empty, not because the Harrows sought company, but because company found them, drawn by some quality of the place that was difficult to name but easy to feel: a rightness, a steadiness. Travelers stopped, neighbors lingered, children, other people's children, discovered that the Harrow kitchen was a place where questions were answered seriously, and cookies appeared without being asked for. A boy named Daniel, the youngest of a homesteading family 3 miles east, began appearing on Saturday mornings sometime around 1881, ostensibly to help Elias with whatever needed doing. But really, as everyone understood, because his own home was crowded and loud, and the Harrow cabin was quiet in a way that felt, to a certain kind of child, like breathing room. And he was 9 years old and very serious about everything, and Elias taught him to repair fence line and identify bird calls and sharpen a blade correctly. Mara taught him to read. Not formally, just steadily, over those Saturday mornings, with whatever book was at hand, sitting at the kitchen table with cups of tea while Elias worked outside and the creek went about its business. By the time Daniel was 12, he had read everything in the house twice, and Mara had written to a cousin in St. Louis for more books. Elias, returning one afternoon to find Daniel and Mara deeply absorbed in an argument about whether a character in some novel had made the right choice, leaned in the doorway and watched them for a moment without announcing himself. He looked the way a man looks when he has found, after long searching, exactly the right word, and set it carefully into place and stepped back and seen that it fit. It was Mara who said it first, and only once, and quietly. A December evening, 1882. The fire low, the cabin still. 10 years since they had staked their rope rectangle in new spring grass. She was looking at the cradle. She had gone up to the nursery for something, a quilt for a neighbor, and Elias had followed and found her standing there. "I think," she said, "that we were given something different from what we expected." She was not weeping. Her voice was level and clear, the way water is clear when it is very deep. "Yes," he said. He came and stood beside her. "But it is still very good," she said. The winter of 1883 tested them in ways that previous winters had not. It began in November with a cold so sudden and complete that the creek froze from bank to bank in a single night, something that, in 11 years, Elias had never seen. The cattle of 3 neighboring families were lost in a blizzard before Christmas. A family named Keswick, 4 miles north, lost their roof to a collapsed pine and were without shelter from one afternoon to the next. Elias was at their door with tools before dark. He and 2 other men from the area worked through 3 days of brutal cold to shore up the Keswick walls and rig a temporary ceiling that would hold until spring. Mara, meanwhile, had the Keswick family, husband, wife, grandmother, and 4 children between 2 and 10, installed in the upper rooms of the Harrow cabin, as if this had always been the plan, which perhaps, in some essential way, it had. The cabin was full that winter, in a way it had never been. There was no privacy and not quite enough of anything. Firewood had to be rationed carefully, and Mara stretched her stores through a series of soups and corn dishes that impressed even the Keswick grandmother, who had been cooking on the frontier since before Mara was born. But the walls held, the hearth held, and the table, all 6 chairs filled and 2 stools brought in from the barn, held every evening while 8 people sat down to whatever there was and were grateful for it. Elias worked through that winter at the edge of his physical capacity, not just for the Kewicks, but for the whole community of scattered homesteads that had come to rely, quietly and without formal arrangement, on the particular competence and steadiness of Harrow. He was 36 that year and still strong, but the cold settled into his hands in a way it hadn't before, and some mornings he flexed his fingers for a long time before they cooperated. Mara noticed. She said nothing directly. That was not their way. But she began leaving a basin of warm water by the stove each morning and setting out his thicker gloves without comment. And he accepted these things in the same spirit they were offered. There were harder moments that winter, private ones. One evening, with the Keswick children finally asleep upstairs and the adults sitting quietly around the dying fire, Elias heard one of the Keswick children cry out in a dream. He heard Margaret Keswick rise and go to her child. He heard her voice, low and certain, speaking comfort in the dark. He sat very still. Across the table, Mara was mending by candlelight and did not look up, but her needle paused for a single moment and then resumed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that until the fire was ash, and then they banked the coals and went to bed. And in the morning, everything was ordinary again, practical and purposeful and demanding, as frontier mornings always were. Spring came late that year. When it came, the creek flooded its lower bank and took out the south fence, and the apple trees stood in ankle-deep water for 2 weeks before it receded. Elias walked the fence line when the water pulled back, tallying the damage with the deliberate calm of a man who has learned to assess before he reacts. The trees had survived. Their roots were deep enough, and he walked back to the cabin and told Mara, and she said, "Of course they did." The years that followed the hard winter settled into a rhythm that was less dramatic and more sustaining, the kind of life that does not make for grand stories, but produces, over time, something more durable than drama. Elias's hair went gray at the temples through the 1880s, gradually enough that Mara claimed she didn't notice until a stranger mentioned it, and she looked at him properly for the first time in weeks, and said, with considerable amusement, that he looked distinguished. He said he felt like a horse who has been out in the rain too long. She found this very funny, and told the story to Ruth Calloway when Ruth passed through again in the summer of 1886. Ruth had changed too. Her children were nearly grown, her own hair showing silver, not her laugh exactly as it had been 12 years earlier, when she arrived with a broken wagon wheel and a baby on her hip. She stayed a week and slept in the room off the kitchen and helped Mara put up the summer preserves and argued with Elias about the proper way to repair a stone hearth. Their friendship had become one of the fixed things. Daniel, the serious boy who had appeared on Saturday mornings for years, was a young man now, 20 years old in 1892, and had secured a teaching position at the new schoolhouse being built in the growing settlement of Millhaven, 8 miles east. He came to tell the Harrows before he told his own parents, which neither of them mentioned to him, but which both of them understood. Mara gave him 3 books she had been saving. Elias gave him a folding rule, a good one, brass-fitted, that had belonged to his own father. "For measuring things carefully," Elias said. "Daniel, who was still serious about everything at 20, but had added a wry quietness to it that was entirely his own, said he hoped he would be half as good a teacher as Mrs. Harrow. Mara said he would be better, and meant it. There were harder things too, as there always are. The late 1880s brought a stretch of dry summers that shriveled 2 consecutive kitchen gardens and forced careful rationing. Elias's hands, which had never fully recovered from the winter of 1883, sometimes troubled him in cold weather to the point where Mara took over the heavier tool work without ceremony, and he accepted this without ceremony because that was how they managed difficulty, practically without theater. A horse was lost to an illness in the spring of 1890, and the replacement cost more than they had planned, and there were 3 months of very careful arithmetic at the kitchen table. Mara took in washing from 2 families in Millhaven that summer. She did not complain. When Elias said he was sorry, she looked at him over the account ledger and said, "We are not behind. We are adjusting." He had loved her in the bright certainty of youth. He found, moving through his 40s, that he loved her now in a way that had no name in common usage, something composed of accumulated mornings, of having been witnessed in difficulty and not diminished, of knowing that she knew him entirely and had decided, repeatedly and without fanfare, to remain. The cabin itself was showing its decades now, the boards dark and smooth, the porch railing worn to a shine where hands had rested on it through 30 seasons of watching the creek go by. But it was sound. Every joint, every window, every dovetailed corner, built to last and lasting. The apple trees were enormous. They produced, every autumn, more fruit than 2 people could ever use. In January of 1893, Elias fell ill. It was not catastrophic, a deep chest cold that settled in and stayed, resisting the passage of weeks, keeping him close to the fire and shorter of breath than he liked. He was 46 years old and had not been seriously unwell in 20 years of frontier life, and he was a poor patient in the specific way of men who are accustomed to being useful. Mara managed him with a firm gentleness that he found both annoying and deeply comforting. For 3 weeks, the cabin was very quiet. She sat with him every evening, reading aloud. The fire was kept high. The creek moved beneath its ice outside. One evening in the 2nd week, when the fever had eased but the weakness remained, Elias lay watching the firelight move on the ceiling and said, without preamble, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like?" Mara, who was sitting in the chair beside him with a book open in her lap, did not ask what he meant. "Yes," she said. A long silence. The fire shifted. "I used to think I had failed you," he said. "That particular dream." She set the book down. She looked at him directly, the way she always had, not around the difficulty, but through it. "Elias," she said, "I have lived in this house for 21 years. In that time I have fed more people than I can count. I have watched children learn to read at that table. I have seen neighbors through storms and sickness and moved on grief. I have built something with you that stands." She paused. "You have not failed me. You have made me a life." He looked at her for a long time. "The same is true in reverse," he finally said. "Every word of it." She reached over and took his hand. Outside, the creek moved under its ice, deep and continuous, carrying the cold season patiently toward spring. It always arrived. He was on his feet by February. By March, he was back at the fence line, walking the property in the particular deliberate way of a man who is relearning the fit of his own days. The cold had left something in his chest that eased slowly, like ice in a shaded hollow. But it did ease, degree by degree, as the light returned and lengthened, Mara watched from the east porch without watching, in the way she had always managed such things. Spring, as it always did, arrived. The spring of 1932 came to Willow Bend Creek in the same way it always had. Abruptly and generously, the meadow going green almost overnight, the creek running high and clear with snowmelt from the mountains, the cottonwoods releasing their new leaves into an air that smelled all at once of everything beginning. Elias was 85 years old that April. He dressed himself slowly in the mornings now, each motion considered and deliberate, but he dressed himself, that had always been the point, and came down the stairs holding the rail and found Mara already at the stove, 82 years old, and making coffee with the unhurried authority of a woman who has made it in this kitchen 10,000 times and intends to make it 10,000 more. 60 years. The number sat in him some mornings with a pleasant weight, not the weight of something heavy, but of something solid. The weight of stone that has been fitted so long into its place that it has become indistinguishable from the land around it. The cabin had been added to and repaired and repainted and added to again until it was something more than its original self. A long, well-kept structure with wide porches on two sides, the windows fitted with good glass that caught the morning in particular ways. The garden Mara had tended for 6 decades, dense with perennials that came back every year without asking. The apple trees along the south fence were old and magnificent, their trunks thick as a man's waist, their branches arching over the fence in great gestures of abundance. They had outlived the cattle operation, outlived the original fence posts, outlived the wagon that had first brought supplies from Billings, outlived the circuit preacher and the 2 neighboring homesteaders who had witnessed the wedding. They had outlived, gently and without grief, the particular dream of particular rooms filled with particular lives, and had discovered, in its place, something that did not have a neater word than fullness. Daniel, who was 60 years old now and had been teaching school in Millhaven for 4 decades, came out on a Saturday in April with his wife and 2 grandchildren, as he had been doing on and off for 40 years. He still called Mara Mrs. Harrow, and she had stopped correcting him approximately 30 years ago because it gave her a private satisfaction she couldn't entirely explain. His grandchildren were 7 and 9, and they disappeared into the garden within 10 minutes of arriving and emerged periodically to present Mara with interesting stones from the creek path, which she received with full seriousness and added to the collection on the east porch shelf. Ruth Calloway had died in 1918, which was one of the griefs that Mara kept folded quietly inside her. But Ruth's daughter Vera had taken up the habit of correspondence and sent letters regularly from Oregon, and there was a standing invitation to visit that both parties understood would likely never be acted upon, but that was genuine for all that. In the afternoon, while Daniel and Elias sat on the front porch with coffee and did the particular thing old friends do, talking about nothing of consequence with the deep satisfaction of men who have been talking together long enough to know the value of it, Mara took the 2 grandchildren upstairs. She took them to the nursery. It looked different now than it had in 1872, more lived in, more layered. The cradle was still there, still under the east window, but it had company now, a small shelf of books accumulated over decades, a needlework sampler June Birch had sent from Colorado 15 years after her 4-day visit, 2 drawings by children who had passed through and left pieces of themselves behind without knowing it. The curtains had been replaced 3 times but were always white with a small pattern, because that was the tradition. And the 2 children looked at everything with the focused attention of people seeing something for the first time that they can sense has a long history. The younger one, the 7-year-old girl, who was called Bess, looked at the cradle for a long time. "Was this for a baby?" she asked. Yes, Mara said. Your baby? A baby, Mara said, that I had in my mind for a very long time. And then, she considered how to say it, looking at the cradle with the calm expression of a woman who has had 60 years to arrive at peace with a thing. Life filled up differently, not less, just differently. Bess thought about this. Like when you want blueberries and there aren't any, she said, but there are strawberries instead, and you didn't know you wanted strawberries, but you did? Mara looked at her for a moment. Exactly like that, she said. Exactly. When they came back downstairs, Elias was watching her from the porch, and she came and stood beside him after Daniel and the children had gone to the garden, and he took her hand. 60 springs they had stood somewhere on this land together. This was just one more, but it was also the accumulation of all of them. Every April morning they had ever shared, every season turned and turned again by the creek that did not stop, by the trees that kept their deep roots through everything, by the walls of a cabin built for a particular kind of fullness that had found, over 60 years, its own particular form. He was old. She was old. Their hands were mapped with the evidence of everything they had done and built and endured and chosen. He held hers. She held his. The apple trees bloomed along the south fence, white and extravagant and sure of themselves, the way they were every spring, as if winter were a rumor they had never quite believed. The stranger, who asked the question in 1887, the one about why such a large cabin had been built for only 2 people, passed through Willow Bend Creek again in 1932, an old man himself by then, and found it still standing. He stopped on the road and looked. 2 figures on the front porch, a hand held, the sound of children's voices coming from somewhere behind the cabin, in the garden. He did not knock. It seemed wrong to interrupt. He stood there a long moment, looking at what 60 years of kept faith looks like from the outside. Then he went on his way, carrying it with him.